There we go. We're going on to Facebook. We're going on to minimize that. Got it. We're being streamed and our attendees are logging in. Good evening, everybody. It's a late night here on the East Coast for the HCMA team. And it is late afternoon on the West Coast. Those West Coasters, they always get us. We got to stay awake late for you guys tonight. So I'm going to get everything started here in a moment. If you're joining us on Facebook at 9:04 p.m. on October 11th, 2022, we are live, but we are in the Zoom room. So you will only be able to ask questions in the Zoom room. So if you would like to join us, you can still go to the HCMA website and log on and register for the event and join us in the room where you will be able to be interactive and ask questions using, for those of you who are in the webinar, the QA button at the bottom of your screen. At any time during tonight's presentation, you can post a question. Our faculty may answer it in typewritten form, or they may go ahead and wait for a break after a presentation, and then they will answer the questions at that point. I am going to launch a poll, and you are welcome to take that poll throughout the evening. And after a couple of presentations, we'll take a look at the poll and see who's here and why you're here. Some of you are here because you're newly diagnosed. Some of you are here because you're seeking questions to seeking answers to specific questions. And you can let us know why you're here. And we are going to hopefully answer a lot of your questions tonight. I am Lisa Salberg, founder and CEO of the HCMA, and I am joined by two of our team members here tonight. And Julie Russo can give a little wave. Julie is our volunteer coordinator. So if you're interested in volunteering with the HCMA, Julie can help onboard you for that. And Stacy Titus is our Center of Excellence coordinator, who works to help us develop our programs and keep everything running and coordinate events like this as well. And we are really excited tonight to be joined by our West Coast team at Stanford. And Euan, why don't you introduce us to your team and tell us a little bit about what you have in mind for us tonight.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for the welcome. And of course, it's always a joy to be with you. And I want to start by thanking you and the team for all the amazing work that you do and have done now for, well, longer than I can remember, for so many. And you don't look a day older than when we first met. So I just want to make sure.
Very well said.
Yeah. And so anyway, very happy to be with you from the West Coast, and welcome to everyone on the call, wherever you are. Very excited to welcome a few members of our team who will be representing our broader team here at Stanford, and I will introduce them in the order in which they appear on my screen. So Julia Platt, first of all, is joining us as our lead genetic counselor. We are lucky enough to have, well, she'll correct me, somewhere between 8 and 10 cardiovascular genetic counselors who are part of our team at Stanford, helping to look after hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patients. Next to my screen is Nancy Robles, who is one of our nurse practitioners at Stanford, who helps us look after all of our patients. Next to her is Dr. Victoria Parikh, who's one of our faculty members here at Stanford, specializing in the care of patients with cardiomyopathy, particularly hypertrophic and arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathies. She also runs a research lab of some national repute. And so we're very happy to have her with us today. Not pictured on screen is Will Hiesinger, who is our surgeon who works very closely with our Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Center and patients. Particularly, he is head of both our mechanical support and transplant program and is our principal myectomy surgeon. And he is very accomplished. And after looking after his young children, he will be joining us in the not too distant future. And last, but absolutely and certainly not least, Heidi Salisbury is the lead nurse on our team. We do, of course, you met Nancy a moment ago, have a range of specialist nurses who help lead an entire team looking after our patients. Many of them have specialty qualifications in genetics, and of course, all are devoted to the care of patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And finally, of course, I am the last and the least important member of the team. I am the director of the Center for Inherited Cardiovascular Disease at Stanford. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a few moments, but also have been delighted to be running the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Clinic at Stanford for the last, well, I don't even want to think about that now, but certainly around 15 years. So welcome to everyone on the call. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is.
So. Wow, That was 3 offices ago. So we grow, we change. All right, I'm going to kick off the presentations tonight. If I can remember to put myself on display mode before I do this. It's always fun to do that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the night has to hold for us and a little bit about what's going on here at the HCMA. So I will begin with this slide. So as we progress with different programs of the HCMA, you're going to start seeing some branding changes. And if you want to know what the project that we're working on is, you can kind of look at the sub logos that we're creating to help everybody understand where our programming it is. So this is our Center of Excellence logo, this is our international logo, and this is our HCM Academy logo, which is professional development and education. So it all falls under the banner of the HCMA, and just trying to keep everybody clear on some of the different projects and what we do. So tonight we are doing the Bighearted Warrior Tours. This is an ongoing program. We're entering year 3, and we are going to be doing some more specialty sections coming up next year. So stay tuned for that. Tonight, we're going to learn a little bit about new developments and innovation. We're going to look at sudden cardiac arrest risk, Afib, and lifestyle and exercise. We're going to talk about surgical interventions, transplant and mechanical support. And we're also going to talk about family screening, genetics, and navigating decision-making. All critical topics to those with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and we'll be here to answer your questions throughout the evening as well. We'd like to thank our event sponsors, Boston Scientific, Invitae, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Cytokinetics. Without their financial support of programs like this, we wouldn't be able to do it. So thank you to all of our sponsors. And what we've decided to do is kind of break down our work into our objectives, keeping it simple. So the HCMA, our most important objective is to educate people about symptoms, treatment options for patients, families, and medical providers. And we do this through a number of different programs, including our Tales from the Heart podcast series, where we speak to thought leaders in HCM. Maybe sometimes we even talk to people who author books, like Dr. Euan Ashley. Sometimes we're talking to patients, and sometimes we're talking to industry leaders. So join us typically Friday mornings. I get this Friday off because Marty Marin is traveling out of country, and I just got back in country from Sweden, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So take a Friday morning off, guys. But typically Friday mornings, you can find us podcasting. We have the Bighearted Warrior Tour, which we provide patient education. And we have a lot of services right here at the HCMA office that some are aware of and some are not. We have patient education committee that helps guide our material development. We have our intake and navigation process, our online support systems, our live answered phones. We answer our phones from 9 a.m. in the morning on the East Coast to 7 p.m. East Coast time, so that we have good coverage on the phone. And hopefully you get a live human being answering your calls. If not, that means we're on another call and we'll call you right back. We have our website, we have our online presences, and more. HCM Academy is for medical education, and you can learn more about that on the website. Oh, there we go. Secondly, we are advocating for policy and legislative changes that will improve detection of disease, healthcare access, and matters of importance to the HCM community. I encourage you all to learn more about our HCM Act, which stands for Healthy Cardiac Monitoring Act, which is common sense legislation that is bipartisan. We use it here in the state of New Jersey, and right now we're the only state that uses it. It takes the American Heart Association pre-participation screening physical for student athletes and brings it to all children in the well-child examination. And it also provides professional development for those conducting those screenings. They're looking not only for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but other forms of genetic or acquired heart disease in the young, DCM, ARVC, channelopathies like long QT syndrome, and familial cholesterolemia, all of these types of genetic disorders, as well as congenital defects. So if we are better at identifying those who are at high risk of having disease in the family, we can find families in time and make a difference in terms of diagnosis and treatment. If you want to get involved, Julie, who you just met a moment ago, is organizing call blocks for the next couple of months to start educating lawmakers on what these pieces of legislation can do and how easy they can be to pass. So we hope that you join us in that endeavor. We also look to maintain and develop networks of support for individuals with HCM and their families. And we do that through live discussion groups, which are run several times a week. I know Stanford has a live group that they run as well. And you can find that information on their directory listing on our website. Through our centers of excellence, I've kind of got ahead of my clicks here. Many of our programs have their own individual support groups for the hospital, and we have the more global international type support groups that are available to everybody. We have really active social media. Right now, our private Facebook group, remember on a page, you can look and like and see things, and that might show up on your personal feed. If you're in a private group, the information that you share stays private and it doesn't go on your personal feed. So if you want to join our private group, there's currently 9,000 other big-hearted folks in there looking to share information and learn from each other. So please join the groups. We also have nation-specific groups that we're building up. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And remember that that network of support also includes the ability to call the office, talk to one of our staff. We have advocates here to help you guide through your diagnostic process or your treatment process and help you find resources. And one of those new resources is the new Lori Fund, which is providing micro travel grants to families traveling to HCM Center of Excellence care and or transplant care. So these are micro grants that will max out at $600 a year per individual, per family. And if you are having a financial problem and you cannot get to your center, we can help provide that base funding that might pay for a plane ticket, a train ticket, gas money, meals on the road, a hotel room. We've already issued our first grant and we're really happy to get some more applications in. So if you are in need, please do not hesitate to apply. I mentioned a little bit earlier that we were creating nation-specific support group, or I'm sorry, Facebook groups. We have our main page that you'll see the artwork kind of stays somewhat consistent, but this is the actual page. And then we have the smaller groups and we have individual national groups for different languages. And we started with our group in Sweden, and I have some exciting news on that in a moment. We also are doing it with our friends in the Netherlands, and I'm hoping that we're going to branch out and do one for Italy as well. So all of these processes are in place to provide support for patients whenever they need it. And I'm really excited to be able to help develop out other nations in other languages. We want to increase accessibility to specialized cares for those with HCM, providing evidence-based treatment of HCM. This is our HCMA Recognized Center of Excellence programming. It formally established in 2005, although it was informally in place from about 1997 through 2005. And then we kind of made it a little bit more organized. The original goal was to establish care within a 5-hour drive of most Americans. It was modeled after the best clinical practices and the needs and desires of the patients and families directly. So I think it kind of worked because in 2020, the AHA-ACC guidelines recognize this as the preferred model of care for HCM patients. So I think we did something right there. And as of today, we have, oh my goodness, 46 programs that have been, excuse me, through our full vetting process and are active at this time. We have another about 17 programs in some level of development. And we are hoping, excuse me, to bring more care to more people very soon. We're going to be visiting out in Western Pennsylvania later this month. So I think that one will come on board pretty soon. We just brought in Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York City and Denver, University of Colorado. So things are growing. I know there's not something convenient for every single person so far, but we're working on getting that access a little bit better as time goes on. We also want to promote and publish research on HCM and broaden access to results with the ultimate goal of eradicating the disease. Dare I even use the C word for some things. For those of you who have been part of an HCMA navigation call, you may have been, you may wonder, like, what are we doing with all of that information that we collect during the navigation call? Well, we're going to be creating the HCMA Patient Journey Registry, where you will have the opportunity to consent into our research database, and this information could then be used for expanding understanding of HCM from a different perspective. They're technically called PROMs, which is patient-reported outcome measures. And we have a really unique data set, and we haven't been able to really do much with it because we didn't have the infrastructure, but now we do. And you'll be seeing more information on that in the next couple of quarters. We also have developed our medical affairs committee. We have our website, Antidote Clinical Tracker. So if you want to know if there's a clinical trial near you, all you need to do is visit this little tool, put in your zip code, and you can find out what clinical trials are available for you. We're also working very hard with a number of different providers of pharmaceuticals and genetic therapies to help with clinical recruitment and clinical trial design. We're doing webinars and educational podcasts on some of these programs to hopefully help educate those out there who might be interested in participating in any clinical trials. We've also been faculty at previous FDA clinical trial training programs, explaining to clinical trialists the value of partnering with patient advocacy organizations for reach and understanding of the community. And we're publishing our findings. We just had a publication or a poster, I should say, at HSFA on patients' experiences. The other goal of the HCMA is to partner with complementary organizations that will help us further our mission. These are just some of our partners and our sponsors. We're doing a lot of work with, please excuse me, I'm fighting a cold, which will become obvious as to why I've got a cold in a minute. We have lots of partners now, including the Global Heart Hub and the new HCM Society. So there's now a professional organization for those who are interested in HCM as well. We cannot do things in a silo. We are a team, we are a community, and we all have something to deliver to that community. And hopefully at the end of the day, it's better care, better treatment, better understanding of HCM. These are other sponsors of other projects. So not every sponsor sponsors everything that we do. So we are working with Pfizer, Tenaya, Imbria, Biomarin, BMS, Cytokinetics, and others to help bring the programs about that we're talking about tonight. So we're building a future for HCM that goes beyond the walls of the United States of America. And we're building out HCMAI, lots of initials there. So it basically stands for international. And we're looking to find, and I guess it all really wraps up in the final bullet point here. We're identifying and engaging passionate patients, clinicians, and professional societies, government agencies, and industry partners to improve awareness, diagnosis, and management of HCM worldwide. And for the past 3 years, I've been meeting pretty regularly with a group of individuals from Sweden. They were the first ones to the table saying, we want to try this. And I just got back from Sweden, and they are officially launched as the HCM Swedish Society. And they founded their own nonprofit organization, like a 501c3 here in the United States, but they're a registered charity. And this was an inaugural event that I attended last week in Stockholm, which was really cool. This is a little PR opportunity we had for them. And this is actually a conference center in the middle of Stockholm that, believe it or not, one of my ancestors went to high school in the same building, because you just can't make this stuff up. So you never know where HCM is and where your advocates are going to be, even though that's not the side of the family my HCM came from. So that's what we're up to these days, ladies and gentlemen. Oops, there's a slide missing. Where's my other slide? Uh-oh. Well, I'll get to that one in just a moment. I want to thank my team. We have an amazing team here at the HCMA. We have a new staff member who didn't get her name on here yet. So Olivia, I'm not forgetting about you, but I forgot to update the slide. Our board. And last year we had over 100 dedicated patients, family members, and healthcare professionals as volunteers to the HCMA. It really does take a village, people. I want to thank our team at Stanford, our staff, our contractors, our board, our partners, sponsors, and donors, all of our volunteers, and of course, Brandy, my donor, who's probably not particularly happy right now that I flew to Sweden because I came home with a cold. I do want to also mention that we have an event coming up on October 22nd here in New Jersey called Great Masquerader Ball. And we will keep the ticket sales open until tomorrow at about noon, and then it's closed down. Right now we have about 110 people joining us for this event, and the proceeds from this event will primarily be going to the Lori Fund to help fund those micro travel grants. So if you want to join us, come on out to Jersey. We'll be happy to party with you. If you want to donate something to the event, you can still do that. And that's all I have to say tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to you and Ashley. So come on back on screen, guys. I'm so sorry that
All
this
right.
is getting me.
Lisa, I hope your cough gets better soon. That's a Swedish version of a virus, is it? That you're
It's a Swedish cold. I brought a Swedish cold home.
okay.
I still have my
Did you pick
Swedish
up
cold.
did you pick up a Nobel Prize while you were there by any chance?
I walked by the museum.
Uh-huh.
I asked if I could pick one up, but they didn't have one with my name on
They
it.
didn't. It seems wrong. Seems wrong.
Yeah. I think you got to, we'll find one of our friends there someday, I'm sure, but not yet.
Yes, I hope we will. Well, thank you for the amazing introduction and for taking us through the incredible work that your whole entire organization is doing, and you go from strength to strength, having mastered and been taken over the United States. It seems like you're moving internationally, so that is neither surprising nor something that we would. Well, there's only one of you, but otherwise we
I got a whole team now, Euan. I have an amazing team, and we can do amazing things together. So part of the team is your team, and I'm really curious to see what you have to tell us tonight.
Right. Well, that's a great segue, because I am delighted to be normally the head of this team, but in reality, as I tell almost all the patients, everyone else does all the work. And so I get to kick off this evening, and we have a few talks, I think 4, if I get that right. And each one of us will represent an element of the team and show you some faces from some people in the team, as well as cover a topic of interest, we hope, for patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So I'm going to start by introducing you to our overall center. The Center for Inherited Cardiovascular Disease really grew out of our HCM clinic. So our hypertrophic cardiomyopathy clinic really started in 2006 with basically a part-time nurse named Heidi Salberg, and a new faculty member who had less gray hair than the one in front of you today. And then a few years later, we basically expanded the entire vision. And in fact, this is the scope of the Stanford Center for Inherited Cardiovascular Disease. Cardiomyopathy is probably our largest sub-area. You see that at the top here. And of course, hypertrophic and dilated cardiomyopathies make up most of those, though we see patients with all forms of cardiomyopathy and of an inherited kind, including those associated with neuromuscular disease, which is shown next door, and those who have cardiomyopathy associated with other syndromes. We have as part of our team the Marfan clinic that also existed at Stanford, actually even before the HCM clinic, but they fall under our umbrella, and we're all trying to take a family-based approach to care. And so there are many consistencies among the different clinics and many similarities in what we try to do for our patients. So it makes sense that we come together under one umbrella. Marco Perez leads our long QT and channelopathy clinic, and Lisa earlier was talking, of course, about connections HCMA has with other patient organizations representing other diseases and other patients and families with inherited cardiovascular disease. Josh Knowles runs our familial hypercholesterolemia clinic, and that is part of our preventive cardiology clinic. And finally, we actually have, if anyone's interested, we have a spot available. We don't have a director currently for our sports cardiology program, but we are looking to hire someone into that position. And certainly our physicians, including those you'll hear from the healthcare team tonight, do see young athletes, both who are referred to us through the Stanford athletics program, through other local college and high school athletics programs, as well as professional athletes. And of course, we hope for most of them that we don't end up diagnosing them with an inherited cardiovascular disease, but we also understand that at times that is what will happen. So currently the entire center, as I say, the largest single number of clinics are cardiomyopathy, and I think the largest single group of patients within it are hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patients. But in total, we have somewhere between 15 and 20 clinics, if you include the clinics that our genetic counselors run, that our nurses run, and that our physicians run. We exist across both pediatrics and adult care. And so our two hospitals, in fact, there's 4 hospitals because there's 2 old ones and 2 new ones, but basically 2 hospitals, a children's hospital and an adult hospital, are run and are connected both physically and through the fact that we practice across those boundaries. And we try to make things as easy as possible for the families that come to see us if they have children that need seen in the children's hospital and adults that need seen in the adult hospital. That coordination does not come widely with the complicated medical system that I know many of you on the call are very familiar with, but we do our very best. So that's our model of care. We have a weekly meeting where we discuss patients, where we discuss new topics of relevance across the spectrum of cardiovascular, inherited cardiovascular disease. We have regional meetings. We have a seminar series that Vicky Parikh, who will talk to you shortly, runs. And we connect every few years with our colleagues on the national stage running a meeting. Of course, COVID has delayed that for some time, but we look forward to getting back to that in the near future. So, having told you a little bit about our team, my topic to begin with is what is new, and in particular, what is new in HCM. This is a photo, actually, of my wife. That's her. I better choose the right person in this boat. I think that's her at the front, but that may be her at the back. I should have worked that out before joining tonight. Anyway, she was kind enough to share this photo from me. And some of you will already have worked out why I'm showing you a picture of a rowing boat. She gets up at an unearthly hour of the morning, around 4:30 a.m. to go rowing 3 times a week. I think it's because the water is flat, but it does seem like a torture. And as someone who was traditionally a night owl who went to bed, between 1 and 2 a.m. for most of my life, you would understand that there's very little time that we share in the same bedroom, because she's getting up about an hour or 2 after I go to bed. These days I go to bed a little earlier to look after my aging bones, but she still gets up at 4:30 a.m. And this was a picture taken just from a month or 2 ago from one of her rowing expositions. Now I'm showing a picture of a rowing boat because some of you may be aware that we often use the analogy of rowing to explain how the molecular motor of the heart works. And not a surprise, I think, to many of you that the major new topic in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is myosin inhibition. And many of you on the call, I think, will also be familiar with how that works. But the story itself is actually pretty interesting. And this has been an idea that's been around for a while. But from my perspective, I first heard of the idea of trying to find a drug that might do this about something like 12 years ago. And this is work that had come out of the lab of a Stanford professor called James Spudich, who spent his life studying the molecular motor of the heart. The molecular motor in biology. He had specifically not been studying the heart, and we had spent several years trying to persuade him to do that. But he would tell us that he wasn't able to generate enough of the human protein in his lab in order to study it. And he had these amazing tools for studying it. And I mean, when I say amazing, I mean tools that allow you to basically hold one molecule between 2 lasers and then give some fuel to another molecule. And as you'll hear in a moment, this is the molecular motor works with a pulling action. But he would be holding 2 of these molecules in place and basically measuring the force produced by one molecule on another. So that's just one of his tools. He had several with which he could monitor myosin and actin, which are the 2 key molecules that are part of muscle really across the entirety of biology, but in particular for cardiac muscle. And essentially, at one point, he managed to solve that along with a colleague called Leslie Lemond, who's from Colorado. And he was able to start applying his knowledge that he gained over 30 or 40 years. He won an award called the Lasker Award, which is generally viewed as the warm-up to the Nobel Prize for this work, essentially elucidating the molecular mechanism of muscle. And so it was really good news when we were able to persuade him, and he had the tools available to turn his knowledge and his experience and his insight towards cardiac myosin. And of the many insights that came out of that, one was the idea that we know in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that the muscle pulls really too hard. And I should step back for a moment and just say that we've known about this disease for over 300 years. Some of the earliest cases 300 years ago of people who died suddenly and were found later to have a very thick heart were descriptions in medical history. I would say for about 70 years now, we have understood much more about the actual pathology and the family base of the condition. We've known now for 30 years, just under 30 years, the genetic basis of the condition with studies done out of Boston in the early 1990s. But despite that, we haven't until this year had a drug that was targeted at the underlying mechanism of disease. We've had drugs that were old drugs that were developed, I think in the 60s or 70s, were applied to HCM in the 80s and 90s. I think drugs like beta blockers, drugs like calcium channel blockers that are predominantly developed for high blood pressure or for heart failure, that we apply to try to help patients to reduce their risk of bad rhythms of the heart, and they have to try to encourage their hearts to kind of calm down. But we also know those drugs were not developed with any understanding of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. They were the best drugs we had at the time. But as many of you will know, they have side effects. Beta blockers block your adrenaline, which makes most people feel kind of tired. It makes some people have bad dreams. And there are other side effects too. So while those drugs have been helpful to many patients, what we've overall found is that many other patients were unsatisfied and really feeling that we didn't have a good drug for HCM. Well, in steps Jim Spudich then with his knowledge of myosin, the molecular motor of the heart, and he starts to think about how we might change that molecular motor to more favorably impact HCM. And so the reason I'm showing the rowing boat is that there are two key components. I talked about two molecules. One's called myosin and one's called actin. And really, I love this analogy because I remember from being 20 years old and being in pre-med that the physiologist, the professor of physiology, who was really a Shakespearean sort of individual. He was larger than life. He talked in a very animated way. And during our physiology lecture, 250 Scottish, kids basically in a lecture hall, he would explain how the heart muscle works by jumping up on the desk at the front of the lecture hall and putting his arms in the air and his legs in the air and saying, myosin rose through the actin sea. And you can tell that this has stayed with me all these years. Myosin rose through the actin sea. And that's a good way of remembering how the heart works. Basically, myosin is the molecule that does the rowing, and actin is the sea, basically. And when millions of those tiny little myosin heads grab onto the actin and pull, then you get force. And that's how all muscles work. And it's how the heart muscle works. So if you have too much force, and some of his science was what established that there was too much force, then and you want to turn that force down to have a very specific therapy for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, then you need an assay that can measure that. And his lab was able to do that. In fact, one of the major insights he got on cardiac myosin came to him in a dream. He's a pilot. He likes to fly planes in his spare time. And he also focuses on cardiomyopathy and muscle and myosin. And his wife gave him a book one day and said, please be quiet about muscle and myosin and flying and read this book. He immediately fell asleep after reading the book, a few pages in. But the book was about mesas in the Southwest in Arizona. And these are these flat-topped little kind of mounds that are beautiful to fly over or see on photos. And he started dreaming about those and dreamed that myosin had a flat-topped mesa. And he started to think about the mechanism. All of that led forward to the formation of a biotechnology company as everyone realized that turning down the myosin force might well be a way forward. And that led over the course of the next few years to a small molecule. That's the kind of medicine that was developed that could turn down the force of myosin. Animal studies run by this biotechnology company that looked like it could improve hypertrophic cardiomyopathy signs and probably symptoms as well. Even large animal models that move very rapidly through to testing. This is history now to all of you. We were lucky enough to dose the first patient at Stanford Hospital. When I saw the echocardiograms from those patients, the ultrasounds, my jaw was on the floor. This thing really works, is what I said to Matt Wheeler, one of our colleagues who was doing the study with me. And things moved rapidly forward to the point where, as many of you are aware, at the end of last year, there was a reporting of a phase 3 trial that led to the FDA approval of mavacamten. Somewhere in there, the biotechnology company MyoKardia was bought by Bristol Myers Squibb. It is an amazing story of biotechnology. It's an incredible story of basic science. It includes dreams, it includes rowing, it includes muscle. And the most important thing is it now includes a drug that is focused on the underlying mechanism of disease. And if you do that, what you find is a drug that really makes patients feel better, and it allows them to do more, definitively shown in the study. What wasn't shown in that first study, but was shown in a small study later on, also a randomized study looking at cardiac MRIs, is that the hearts actually got less thick, both less thick, the overall mass was lower, the left atrial size was lower, suggesting in every way that these hearts were functioning much more normally. And so it's a really exciting moment, and that's what's new. And then the important thing, which is almost as hard as everything I just described, is how do you get it to patients? So I mentioned we dosed the first patient, part of the first phase 1 trial at Stanford. This is our patient who was the first one to be approved and to be taking the Camzyos, the approved version of mavacamten, and she's smiling. I think she's still smiling after taking even more than one pill, so we're happy about that. But she wouldn't have been able to get to that point if it wasn't for the incredible teamwork of our mavacamten champions. And this is a slide prepared by Heidi Salberg, our lead nurse for our group. Shout out to her. I think she's on the call here somewhere. But this entire team is really what makes the cogs turn, because there's a lot of paperwork, as many of you on the call know. Just to get to the point of approval, there's a lot of observations and ultrasounds that happen afterwards, and it's just a real significant moment for our whole community and organization, but also for, I think, the principle of patients and team members, healthcare team members coming together to make something really unusual happen. So great story. So that's what's new, but that's probably something you knew about. A couple of other mentions for things that the team are doing. We now have a cardiomyopathy patient support group that has been meeting pretty regularly, the first of every month, both for patients with hypertrophic and dilated cardiomyopathy. There are usually a discussion and a short presentation and lots of questions. So if anyone on the call is interested in joining those, you will see the QR code on the screen. Also, we have an annual event. I didn't mention this earlier, but it actually started as a push-up competition with the 49ers that we ran every year. But by the way, we used to win, but mainly because they wouldn't let the actual 49ers participate. So we went up against the trainer. I think we won 2 out of 3 times. But my memory is a bit fuzzy now. That has been replaced now with a 5K, 10K, and fun run. These are some kids having fun. We talk about heart heroes, and we give away these capes, and you can see the details on the screen of just the success of this team event that we've had. Our oldest participant was 94 years old. And if I draw your attention to the left of the screen here, one of these individuals is worth several $1 billion. And it's not me. But this person is our main hero, 94 years old, participating in person, but also joining Heart Fit for Life, which is our cardiac rehab group. And then, of course, we have some Silicon Valley celebrities who show up as well. Mark Zuckerberg and his family have come to each of the events in the last couple of years. So those are the community events that the team organize. And then just a couple of other new things before I hand over to the rest of the team. We focus in, and each of us that sees patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy also runs a laboratory, and in basic to translational to clinical lab, where we think about 2 things, really, reading the genome, because this is a genetic disease, and writing the genome. And that gets to the word that Lisa used earlier, which I'll come to. But first of all, in reading the genome, we've moved from the point where to read a genome was a $3 billion, 10-year, 10-country major project, to the point where just in the last month, the idea of a $100 genome has been announced, and probably by next year that will be true, $100. So to put that in perspective, I often show a picture of a Ferrari that's $400,000 that I used to look at wistfully on El Camino Real. If I dropped the price of that Ferrari as much as human genome sequencing has dropped, it would now be worth 1 cent. You could buy that Ferrari for 1 cent. That's how much genome sequencing has dropped in price. And it's taken us to an interesting place where we really have broadly and readily available genetic testing. It's still complicated. Our system is complicated, and in some insurance companies pay and others don't. But we have the capacity now to look not just for the single variant that causes the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in families, but potentially to look across the rest of the genome to say, why does this individual in the family have severe disease and this one have less severe disease? We can think about the polygenic architecture, in other words, all those other gene variants together. We can start to think about pharmacogenomics. What is it in the genome that tells us whether people should have this drug or that one? And pharmacogenomics is important for mavacamten. So we're looking at running a study to help explain that. And now all of the patients who have genetic testing at Stanford have a whole genome run in the background. And that's just starting from this time last year. So a whole new world compared to where we started even our clinic 10 or 15 years ago. And finally, the future. We're looking from going from just reading the genome to writing it. And the only thing better than a small molecule drug that you can take that can slow down that myosin and reduce the force would be something that could actually swap out that genetic letter that was causing the genetic disease and correct it with the right letter. And so this idea of gene editing has been around for a while. Each of us in our labs is exploring ways of doing this. We have ways of curing this disease in a dish. It is absolutely possible using today's technology to take patient cells, turn them into heart cells, and then cure them of HCM. That's a major advancement, Nobel Prize winning technology from the perspective of both CRISPR, the gene editing, and the cells that how we make the way we turn cells from blood cells into heart cells. We have even better tools than just CRISPR now, base editor tools where we can swap one letter for another. And so the tools in the dish and our ability to cure the disease in the dish is absolutely here today. That's not science fiction, that's science fact. But thinking about what we need to do is work out how the vehicle, it's all about the vehicle. How do we get that, that treatment from in a dish into our patients and into their hearts? So the challenge now is delivery, and that's what we're working on. But I'm pretty confident in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be looking at many, many more clinical trials, several of which will be focused on trying to correct the basic genetic change that is causing many of our patients hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Well, that's all I'm going to share with you tonight. The rest of my team are poised and ready to go, and I'm excited to hear from them. But also, if there's a moment, I can take a question, but I think I've probably used up most of my time. Oh, there's that thing too. Yes, I'm contractually obliged to mention this book, of which there's a paperback. There's even a podcast with Lisa Salberg where you can hear the author interviewed. Just in case you're interested.
That was part of our pandemic fun, doing that to us.
It was.
We had to keep ourselves entertained somehow or another. So Euan, I was going back in my memory to a conference room. Oh God, it was a while ago. It's got to be 10, 12 years ago. And you gave a talk, is the $1,000 genome possible? Right. And I believe your prediction was you thought it would be possible in like 7 years. I think you beat that, and now you're telling me that $100 genome is possible. Yeah, it's pretty wild, isn't it? Yes. Yeah, it's pretty wild. Yeah, we've moved pretty quickly, pretty quickly to get to these points. It's that whole, the faster you come up with discovery, the faster advances come, and the more you learn, and the faster it goes. And it's pretty amazing the minds out there today. So bravo on those predictions, because they seem to have worked. We do have a question. I don't necessarily, I know the answer to it, but I'll let you answer it. The individual questioning has non-obstructive HCM and is currently status 6 on a transplant list. Is mavacamten potentially an option for somebody like this? Well, there's two aspects to that question. That's a really good question. One, of course, is will mavacamten or other myosin inhibitors, as you mentioned, aficamten, of course, which is in phase 3 trials, there may be others coming behind it, but are myosin inhibitors going to be able to be used for non-obstructive patients? So that's question one. And then two, what about our crazy transplant listing system? So let me deal with, they're both really good questions. The first is that we don't know yet exactly what's going to happen in relation to non-obstructive patients and myosin inhibition. There is no reason to believe that non-obstructive patients would not gain significant benefit from myosin inhibition, because the molecular mechanism of the disease is basically the same. The companies have, for practical reasons, really focused on obstruction because it's something that's easy to measure. And it's something, of course, that's relevant for patients, and especially from a trial perspective, it's something they knew they could hit. They were confident that if they make obstruction a real focus, oh, my dog's coming to join us now, sorry. Okay. If they made obstruction a focus, they were sure that they could hit that endpoint. So the phase 2 studies have tended to focus on obstruction. The good news is, of course, the phase 3 studies focused on how do patients feel and how much can they do. And it was effective there.
Of course, some of that effect is reducing the obstruction, but I think a large amount of the effect is the molecular change. This is a medicine that works at a molecular level. So it's certainly my belief that these myosin inhibitors will be very effective if we can do the right study and find the right endpoint for non-obstructive patients, and they will indeed be available. At the beginning, of course, new drugs are going to be very closely regulated, and the FDA is going to hold us to the patients that they approved this for, and well, it's going to hold us to the patients who were in the first and initial trials. But you can bet that the pharma companies are going to be interested in the largest number of patients possible getting this drug. And that might even include patients who don't have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but have other forms of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. But that's a whole other conversation for another day. So that's my main answer. And then the question of status 6 on the transplant list is, we really fought against that. I know Lisa did. And at our center, we put in a lot of feedback around that as well. And we didn't win. We are not, it's not holding us back too much, however. I mean, I think it's not what we wanted. We hoped for something else.
Typically, they're listed as a status 4. His situation,
Right.
I haven't quite figured out why they popped him in as 6, but
well, it's almost like it's probably in the end more technical than we have time to get into tonight. But yeah. what I would say in terms of the what's happening is it's not holding us up from getting these patients to transplant, and that's the most important thing. I think that, you know, that the default starting position is 6. 4 is also possible, but in most cases we're getting patients transplanted from status 2, and sometimes 3 exceptions. And so we're really hopeful to be able to move people forward, and we're able to do that. It's this listing anomaly is not actually holding us back. That's the good news.
I would add that it is publicly disclosed by VMS in their stock filings that the non-obstructed protocol is moving forward, as is the heart failure with preserved ejection fraction that was announced back in April, and they were looking for a 4th quarter start on that. So there are going to be other trials with myosin inhibitors in different populations, and even potentially for children at some point. So the doors are opening. There will be other opportunities for clinical trial, and hopefully those who are listening and might be interested will inquire with their local clinical trial coordinator and see if maybe they might qualify for a clinical trial. So this is what we hope. So Euan, what's up next from your team?
You know, actually, I don't know, but I think it's Vicky because she's waving at me.
Yep.
I introduced her earlier then, and I will hand over now to Dr. Vicky Parikh.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Euan and Lisa, for organizing today, and thank you everyone who is here attending the seminar. My name is Vicky Parikh. I'm one of the cardiologists in the Center for Inherited Cardiovascular Disease, as Euan just introduced. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at Stanford. So not only do I see patients in the clinic, where I've worked for almost 9 years, actually, starting with training with Euan and Heidi, and now on faculty. I'm really excited to talk today about living with HCM. And I just want to point out that we put some emphasis on the word living with HCM here, because, you know, in our clinic, and I know many of the centers of excellence that Lisa works with and has certified, we really want to focus on the quality of life of our patients. And in addition to mavacamten, really are excited to talk about what we can do to help folks with HCM live long and happy lives. So the 3 topics that I was asked to discuss today are sudden cardiac arrest. How do we know what a given patient's risk is, and how can we prevent it from happening? Atrial fibrillation, which is a disease that is really common in the general population, but also extremely common in HCM, and has some specific important considerations in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that it may not have in the general population. We'll talk about how it can affect your life and also how we can treat it. And then lastly, we really want to spend some time talking about lifestyle and exercise. I think it's really scary when you get a new diagnosis of HCM or another cardiomyopathy because you worry that exercise is going to be bad for your heart, that it's going to put you at risk. So we're going to talk today in detail about what exercise looks like for a heart that has HCM and how we can actually allow that heart to get all the benefits of exercise and of course, the patient that has that heart at the same time that we keep that patient safe. So starting with predicting and preventing sudden cardiac arrest. So the first thing to note is that most people with HCM will not be at significant risk of sudden cardiac arrest. But of course, for those who are, we really want to understand who they are and then understand how the best ways to prevent this from happening for them. So the first thing to do is to step back and ask what causes sudden cardiac arrest in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I think the best way to start understanding that is actually by thinking a little bit about what a heart without HCM looks like, what a heart with normal wall thickness looks like. So this is depicted here. Just a quick review for everyone. All the blood that has gone around your body and given off all its oxygen and picked up all its waste products is going to come back to the heart through these blue veins here into this structure here called the right atrium. The right atrium's main job is to fill this guy here, a main pumping chamber called the right ventricle. The right ventricle's job is to get that blood to the lungs. Because I'm a cardiologist, I can say that the lungs are like the garbage men of the body. And what that means is that they actually clean out that blood and they put nice clean oxygen in it and they put it back here into the left atrium. That left atrium's job is to fill the main pumping chamber, the left ventricle. As you can see in a normal left ventricle, you have normal thickness of the walls, which is about 1 centimeter. And then you also have a normal valve here called the mitral valve. It's a one-way valve. And what that valve's job is to do is to make sure that when this left ventricle pumps, the blood is going to go forward out through the aorta into all of the other organs of the body. If we look microscopically at the wall of a normal heart, you can see that there are these heart cells, as Euan just mentioned. They contain, thousands or millions of these tiny little rowers, of these myosins that are rowing in a sea of actins. And these cells, they all are thin and elongated. They line up next to each other in a way that's parallel so that when they beat together. And that means that you can have a very efficient pumping system in the heart. When we think about HCM, we know that there's thickness of the wall. You can see that that septum or that left ventricular wall here is a lot thicker in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy than the normal heart we were just looking at. And we know that if we look microscopically here, those cells don't look nice and skinny and efficient the way that a normal heart cells do. They look big, they're not facing the same direction. And when they try to beat together, they're going to have a really uncoordinated and inefficient beating. Over time, that leads not only to more wall thickness, but also to exhaustion of those cells. And some of those cells will die and have to be replaced by fibrosis or scar tissue. Just like if you cut yourself and kill some cells on your skin, you develop a scar. The same thing can happen in your heart with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So this brings us back to what causes sudden cardiac arrest. What causes sudden cardiac arrest is a problem with the electrical system where these three cells can no longer speak to each other efficiently, can no longer pass signals between each other that cause the heart to beat, leading to arrhythmias. Those arrhythmias, instead of causing that nice normal beating pattern of a normal heart, can lead to something that looks a little bit more like this, which means that this left ventricle is not able to fill up with blood and it's not able to efficiently pump it out. And that can lead not only to symptoms of dizziness or passing out, but also potentially to sudden cardiac arrest. So how do we know who's at risk of having a sudden cardiac arrest in HCM? These are a list of risk factors that come from the most recent guidelines published by folks who are really, closely involved with HCMA, including Dr. Marty Marin. And they actually list several, major risk factors, which we really pay attention to in our patients. Do they have so much wall thickness, more than 3 centimeters of wall thickness, that we think that they're at higher risk of having that scar tissue and having that risk for sudden cardiac arrest? We also want to pay attention to how well the heart is still pumping. When the heart isn't pumping well any longer, Euan showed that boat and how it's hyperactive. When those cells start to tire out, that's when we see what we call systolic dysfunction. And that can be a sign that that patient is at risk of sudden cardiac arrest. There's extensive, what we call late gadolinium enhancement, LGE, on the MRI, and that is indicative of that scar tissue I was talking about. And there are also arrhythmias that we can find on long-term monitoring when we wear rhythm patch monitors. And then, of course, family history of sudden cardiac death and passing out without another good explanation. Really worried that that was an early arrhythmia. These are things we pay attention to in the US when we think about folks who are at higher risk of sudden cardiac arrest. In Europe, they have developed a risk stratifier where you can put in most of these elements, plus your age, as well as how much of an obstruction there is in your heart. This is actually based on a really large cohort of HCM patients, thousands of patients, where they looked at patients who did have a sudden cardiac arrest, and they asked what features they had going into that could represent risk factors for having that arrest. And so what we're able to do now is take your data, your personalized data, put it into this calculator and understand at a percent per 5-year time period what your risk might be of having a sudden cardiac arrest. If by either one of these two criteria, your physician feels that you are at an elevated risk for sudden cardiac arrest, then our mandate is to talk to you about that and use shared decision-making to decide what the best route is for you in order to prevent that from happening. The data that we have says that, the best intervention we can do medically to prevent sudden cardiac arrest in patients who have a high risk of it is called a defibrillator. You might recognize this over here. It looks a little bit like a pacemaker, which is a device that has wires that go into the heart and has a battery and a little tiny computer that's implanted right under the collarbone. This actually has wires that can listen to the heart. And when they listen to the heart, they're also able to give pacing back to the heart or deliver a shock if the heart goes into a sudden cardiac arrest. That shock can be life-saving, of course. There is a newer, although now actually widely used form of this particular device, which doesn't have to go inside the heart or into blood vessels in order to protect the patient. That's over here on the right. This is called a subcutaneous defibrillator. The way that this works is that it sits, here's the battery here, it sits under the arm, right over the rib cage and tucked a little bit backwards. And a wire from there comes out here and takes a right angle up by the breastbone. This allows for this device to listen across the heart without being inside of the heart to detect a sudden cardiac arrest and deliver a shock as needed. There are advantages for different patients for each type of device. And if your physician feels that you're at significant risk of sudden cardiac arrest, then they will hopefully talk with you about both types and make a recommendation as to which is the right one for you. And then again, you shared decision-making about the prospect of implanting a device like this to prevent sudden cardiac arrest. So we're going to move on from sudden cardiac arrest to atrial fibrillation. And I think what we'll do, if it's okay, is if you wouldn't mind, if you have questions, just putting them in the Q&A, as Lisa mentioned, and then we'll address all of them together at the end. So the next thing we want to talk about is another rhythm, which is not causative of sudden cardiac arrest, but is called atrial fibrillation. Atria, which we talked about being these smaller heart chambers whose main job is to fill the larger main pumping chambers, are responsible for keeping the heart in normal rhythm. It turns out that in the heart, the way that the heart knows to pump is that an electrical signal actually activates those little cells that we were looking at earlier. So in normal rhythm, I like to use the analogy of a captain and a first mate of the ship. So this guy here in the right atrium is the captain. It's called the SA node. And this is the patch of tissue in your heart that knows exactly how fast your heart needs to beat for a given situation and sends an impulse out through the atria, which then travels down toward the ventricles. This is where the first mate sits. The first mate actually decides whether it's appropriate to send all of the signals that are coming from the top of the heart down to the bottom of the heart for a given situation. So if you're running from a lion, then this guy is going to let a lot more impulses through because it knows the heart needs to go faster. But if you are sleeping and for some reason there's an arrhythmia that's causing a rate of 300 beats a minute in the top of the heart, this guy should slow it down. So this fail-safe system is really good, and it's a good design to keep us from having significant arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation causing too fast of a heart rhythm in the bottom of the heart. So in atrial fibrillation, what happens is that there's a mutiny in the atria, okay? What happens is that all the other cells in the atria say, we're not gonna listen to the captain anymore, we're just gonna do our own thing. It's not a very organized mutiny. It means that they're all sort of trying to beat at the same time. And they can go up to 300 beats a minute or even faster. And what that means is that instead of actually pumping blood into the main pumping chambers, these atria are jiggling like this. That can feel really, really bad in the chest, right? It feels like a fish flopping around in your chest for some folks. It also means that you're not efficiently filling your left ventricle, which is particularly hard in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and can lead to symptoms of shortness of breath, as well as dizziness or even passing out. What are the things that make atrial fibrillation worse in HCM and in general? Well, if you have a high left ventricular filling pressure, that means that your left ventricle is thick and stiff, or if you have an obstruction in your left ventricle, that means that it's harder for the left atrium to get blood in, and that can exacerbate atrial fibrillation. Also, if this valve, this mitral valve here between the ventricle and the atrium isn't working, meaning that it's no longer a one-way valve, but it lets a jet of blood back into the left atrium when the left ventricle is trying to pump, that can increase pressure in the atrium and worsen atrial fibrillation as well. High blood pressure in the rest of your body, in your aorta and your other arteries, can also exacerbate that high pressure in the left atrium, as can obstructive sleep apnea. That's something that makes people sort of have micro wakings at night because they have difficulty keeping oxygenated due to problems with their airway, or obesity. If you have atrial fibrillation, these are some of the symptoms that you might feel: shortness of breath, especially with walking or even at rest; palpitations, again, a fish flopping around in your chest or feeling your heart pounding; pain or pressure in your chest because the atrial fibrillation is asking too much of your heart and it can't get enough oxygen to do what it's being asked to do; dizziness or loss of consciousness, as I mentioned. And then the major thing, especially in HCM, that we want to avoid in atrial fibrillation is the risk of a stroke. That stroke happens because that atrium is moving like this, which means that the blood inside of it is not moving out of it fast enough. And that can lead to clotting in the left atrium, which can cause a release of a tiny clot into the left ventricle, which can go to the brain or to other organs. So in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in particular, we know that patients are at least 1% per year risk of having a stroke if they have atrial fibrillation. And for that reason, blood thinners are something that it's really important to talk with your provider or your healthcare professional about if you have both HCM and atrial fibrillation. So how do we treat atrial fibrillation and HCM? Prevention of stroke with blood thinners, like we talked about. Often this is not going to be aspirin, but will be something called a direct oral anticoagulant, like apixaban or rivaroxaban, or even warfarin in some cases. And then lifestyle changes. We want to avoid high amounts of alcohol and caffeine that can exacerbate atrial fibrillation. I want to control the blood pressure in the body, and we definitely want to treat any obstructive sleep apnea or obesity. And then lastly, we have medical therapies. We can treat atrial fibrillation with some of the same medications that have been tried and true for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, including beta blockers and calcium channel blockers. Disopyramide, which is used sometimes in HCM, is actually, an antiarrhythmic that was first used for atrial fibrillation. And then we know that the medication sotalol is actually quite safe for controlling atrial fibrillation in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. There are some medications that are not safe for HCM patients that might be safe for someone with a heart that doesn't have HCM. And so talking with your doctor to make sure that the right medication is being used for your atrial fibrillation is important. Lastly, there are also interventions that we can do, including atrial fibrillation ablations, in which a catheter goes inside of the left atrium in order to prevent the microcircuits that are involved in atrial fibrillation from causing this arrhythmia. And then also there's some evidence that if you have obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, that relieving that obstruction and decreasing mitral regurgitation can be important sort of parts of treating atrial fibrillation, although often they are not enough by themselves. All right, so we'll move on to lifestyle. We think we really want to think about what is safe and also what the benefits are of exercise. And we acknowledge at the Stanford Center for Inherited Cardiovascular Disease, as do many centers of excellence around the country, that exercise is a really important part of a healthy lifestyle for everyone. We know that it causes us to live longer, that it reduces the risk of coronary artery disease, including stroke. It also reduces the risk of diabetes. It helps to fight depression and mood symptoms. And that in the end, if you exercise more, you have a higher exercise capacity. And that can actually let you live a much more enjoyable and really enriching life, whether that's chasing around your grandkids or whether that is, playing that round of golf that it's sometimes hard for you to get through, or whether that's going on a long bicycle ride or even jog. So in HCM, what do we want to think about in order to keep ourselves safe during exercise? Well, the first thing is to note that in maximal exertion, there's the possibility that if we don't do it right, that exercise can actually worsen the obstruction in the left ventricle in patients who have one. There is also, and that's just instantaneous. That's at the time of very peak, high intensity, maximal exercise. It's not something that worsens it over time. Certain types of exercise can put a sudden stress on the heart muscle, which can worsen the risk of arrhythmias. And so can a sudden adrenaline release. So again, if you were being chased by a lion and all of a sudden had to run away from it, there would be a big release of adrenaline, which is a hormone that can worsen arrhythmia. So when we think about really healthy exercise with HCM, we want to try to avoid all of these events. And the way to do that actually allows us to do a lot more than I think folks used to think was possible. So the first thing to think about over here on the right is really sort of the shape of intensity of the exercise that we do over time. So on the top here, I've put a big caution sign to show that if we're doing exercise in which our intensity goes from 0 to 100, either repeatedly and certainly all of a sudden during the course of exercise, that can put us at risk of immediately worsening obstruction in someone who has obstructive HCM, or worsening the stress on the heart all of a sudden. What we want to do with exercise is give our hearts time to warm up so that they're able to both receive the amount of blood and eject the amount of blood that's necessary for healthy exercise. So what healthy exercise in HCM looks like over time for aerobic activity is that we want to have a really slow warm up. We want to sustain about 50 to 70% of our maximal exertion. We'll talk about what that means in a moment for, 30 to 45 minutes, or, even longer for some patients. And then we want to have a really nice slow cool down at the end of exercise. And that allows our hearts to get used to what we're doing. Many of you will note that when you first start to climb a hill, if you have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, you might feel some pressure in your chest or some shortness of breath. But that if you ratchet back your speed and continue to walk slowly, and then can, eventually increase your speed again, that your heart will get used to that amount of exercise, and that those symptoms will resolve themselves. So this is the type of shape of exercise we want to do in order to do safe aerobic activity with HCM. So what does 50 to 70% of your max exertion mean? For some people, it's 60% of their max heart rate on an exercise test that actually did get them to a maximal exercise test. So that's something that you could talk with your doctor about from your most recent exercise test. Or if you want to go by symptoms, this is where we're able to, get through a full sentence or laugh while we're working out, but that we go just a smidge beyond that so that we feel a little bit more breathless than being able to get through a full sentence, but certainly that it's not hard to breathe. And then lastly, exercise prescriptions can be really helpful for HCM patients and many other patients with cardiomyopathy as well, in order to help you understand what it feels like to be at that 50 to 70% of your max possible exertion, and also in order to understand what a slow warm up and a slow cool down feels like as well. We also want to think about weightlifting. We know that weightlifting is really good for our bone strength and in general for keeping our exercise capacity as high as it can be. It's important to note that we want to avoid worsening the obstruction and obstructive HCM, and we also want to avoid increasing the stress on the heart wall by avoiding something called a Valsalva. What a Valsalva maneuver is when you push all the air out of your chest and then release it all of a sudden. Often this can happen when you're trying to lift a really heavy weight. So what we suggest with weightlifting with HCM is to use high rep and low weight exercises that isolate specific muscle groups. We want to avoid doing really low rep, high weight where you're starting to get exhausted with that level of weight at anything less than about 15 reps. And then again, if you feel yourself doing movements that are uncontrolled and causing you to do a Valsalva maneuver where you push all of that air out of your chest, you want to rethink that type of weightlifting and think more about the one on the left. And with that, I want to say thank you so much again for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
And we have questions for you.
Great.
And I'm going to try. Oh my goodness, the cold is coming in worse as the night goes on.
Oh, no.
So just ignore the bad voice. Wow, it got really bad. During an ablation for Afib, the pulmonary vein is isolated, but which one of the 4 pulmonary veins is isolated?
That's such a good question. It's a really interesting one too, because it turns out that, over the last 10 years, the way that we think about atrial fibrillation and how we ablate it has evolved as well. So you're right that a PVI or a pulmonary vein isolation is one way to think about controlling atrial fibrillation. In general, they will try to isolate all of the pulmonary veins, sort of by drawing that path all the way around them. They sort of all insert very close to each other into the left atrium. And then there are other ways of trying to do atrial fibrillation ablation, one of which is called a firm ablation, which actually uses sort of a basket inside of the atrium in order to understand where the sort of knotty cells throwing that mutiny are, so that you can zap them and get rid of that, what we call nidus for arrhythmia. And then, of course, for patients in whom it's just really hard to control AFib with a catheter-based ablation, there are maze operations as well.
That was a really good question, by the way, whoever asked that. I already cleared you out there. Okay. What are some medications that are not safe for atrial fibrillation?
That's a great question. So there are 2 major ones that we see patients prescribed, which we become concerned that they can worsen other types of arrhythmia. Those are called propafenone and flecainide. Often what happens is that the physician that is trying to take care of that patient knows that those are really successful for controlling symptoms in patients without HCM, and may not realize either that the patient they're taking care of has HCM, or that those are what we call contraindicated. So if you are, being prescribed those two medications, they're also called class 1C medications, which are a type of sodium channel blocker, then it's good to go talk to your doctor about other options.
Now we have an exercise question. Surprised there's not more exercise questions. We normally get a lot of them, so you must have done a really good job of explaining to our crowd tonight. But here's the question. When I jog, I don't get too breathless, but I do get really slow, mostly because my legs feel very heavy. Why would that be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We'd want to know a little bit more about at what point of exercise your legs are starting to feel heavy. That can be related to several different issues. One might be that you might be on medications where your heart rate can't go as fast as you might need it to in order to be able to, get what we call enough cardiac output out. So we'd want to talk to your doctor about doing an exercise test and really trying to figure out what might be limiting the ability of your heart to pump enough blood during exercise. And then certainly, once it's been sort of ruled out that it's because of an issue with a medication, or because your heart, may need a little bit of help from another direction, then it may be that we just have to think about how to slowly get you up to a level of exertion that you're comfortable with and that your legs are also able to keep up with.
That is a complicated question. And it can have so many different answers based on the individual. So I would also encourage that person to really have a long conversation with their team. I'm going to save the next question, Chip, for the end, because it may be covered in the genetics talk. So I'm going to leave that one holding for right now. Okay, so I understand the surgeon has entered the room. So hello, Will.
Hey, Will.
You're on mute. You got to hit that little button.
Only 3 years of Zoom and I haven't figured it out.
If I didn't say it to at least 2 people per webinar, I'd feel like something's gone wrong. So now we're going to hear about surgery, and we're going to hear about innovative surgical interventions, transplant, and mechanical support from you. So welcome to Tales from the Heart. I'm tired and I have a cold, so everybody has to give me a little bit of a bye tonight. The Bighearted Warrior Tour, that's what we're doing tonight, people. So Will, without further ado, I think you know how to do the screen share, and we can get going.
Great. So first I'll just introduce myself. My name is Will Hiesinger. I'm a cardiac surgeon here at Stanford. I'm the surgical director of the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Center, and I do the vast majority of the myectomies here. I also run our transplant program, and we'll sort of talk about that a little bit later. I want to thank Vicki very much. I get to work with her closely. I know that she's brilliant, but it's really nice to get to hear her presentation and get an education myself. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Get this up here. Okay. Can everybody see this okay?
Yep, you're good to go.
Perfect. Great. So before I start, I just want to say I'm going to kind of go through some of this stuff fairly quickly to leave a lot of time for questions. Because given that this is the most invasive part of treatment, there's always a lot of questions involving surgery, involving transplant, and sometimes it's best to just jump into those. So as Lisa very kindly said, I'm going to talk about surgical intervention and innovations, transplant, and mechanical support. I'm going to go in that order. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy comes in many different flavors, as I'm sure most of you know. And the problem, and please also forgive me if I'm going through stuff that's been through again. It is a relatively simple mechanical problem when it comes to me, that there is a muscular blockage of the blood that's leaving the left ventricle and trying to get to the aorta. The most common types of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that I see, and the ones that I most treat, are sort of this B flavor and the C flavor, where you have either a discrete muscle mass at the base of the septum, that's the muscle separating the left and right ventricle, or sort of a really thick septum that goes all the way down from base to apex, and we have to core out a new path for the blood to flow. We can see and treat all the other kinds, but this is the most common one that I tend to see. So what are the surgical treatments? Okay, I'm not going to discuss the alcohol ablation too much because that's done by the cardiologists. It is an option. I believe that that's more of an option for patients that are not surgical candidates. The septal myectomy is the gold standard of surgical treatment for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and when done in an experienced center can be very, very successful, and patients get a lot of relief and a lot of satisfaction when they end up needing surgery. So this picture shows the opening of the beginnings of a septal myectomy. It shows if the head is on the left of the screen, the feet are towards the right, and it shows the opening in the aorta that we look through the aortic valve and get a view of the septum, which is what we're going to end up resecting. Okay, so here is a schematic of what we do. Okay, we look through the aortic valve and we resect the extra muscle that is blocking the free exit of blood from the left ventricle to the aorta. We want to take it as far down as we can. I think that's a very important point that's really stressed by many of the leaders, particularly the guys at Cleveland Clinic, that it has to be deep or else it's not or it won't be successful. We take the cut straight down from base to apex, leaving a little bit of room to make sure that we spare the conducting pathways of the heart, and take it down both deep and left and right, almost all the way to the edges of the mitral valve. Okay, we want to resect a certain amount of tissue, but ultimately the most important thing is just creating a free path for the blood. Okay, once that's done, we sew the aorta back up closed, come off bypass, and you're ready to go. In the lower right-hand corner, it shows some techniques with dealing with mitral regurgitation if we need to. So commonly patients with HCM will also have some degree of mitral regurgitation. And that is very often related to the HCM itself, what we call SAM, which is septal anterior motion of the anterior mitral valve leaflet. And that's when the heart is contracting, the anterior mitral leaflet is pulled up against the septum, creating a worse blockage and worse mitral regurgitation. And those two things are inextricably linked. Now, in general, when we do our septal myectomy, just by treating the septum, we are able to take care of the mitral regurgitation. And if we get rid of the blockage, there's usually no more SAM, and that's it. We don't have to intervene on the mitral valve. In a small portion of patients, we do have to do that. And usually we can also do it directly through the aortic annulus, like straight through the aortic valve, just as we do the myectomy. And there's a number of techniques we can use that involve plicating the anterior mitral valve to shorten the length. We can bring the papillary muscles together to bring the anterior leaflet farther away from the septum. There's a number of different techniques. And in general, if your mitral regurgitation is due to the HCM itself, this is treatable and we can take care of that without having to do a separate mitral valve procedure. We can also do that if you have sort of true and unrelated problems. We can take care of that as well. So, forgive me if this is too much sort of technical talk about the steps of the operation itself, but I think it's important. There are obviously risks with any surgical procedure, but in general, it is a very well-tolerated, low-risk procedure. The risk of mortality I would put around 1%, but honestly, it's probably lower than that. I quote that to patients, but knock on wood, I've never had a patient die from HCM surgery. Okay, the biggest risks of the surgery are need for pacemaker and heart block, and that's because we are cutting around the conduction pathways of the heart in the membranous septum. We do our best to avoid that with our knowledge of anatomy, but not everybody's body reads the textbooks. So in general, the risk of needing a pacemaker or significant conduction abnormalities is about 3% at our institution. And you'll see it quoted anywhere from like 1 to 10% in the literature. The second risk that is unique to septal myectomy is what's called a VSD, okay? And that's when we create a hole, you know, when we cut out the extra septal myocardium, and sometimes you can remove too much and create a hole between the chambers. In general, that is also a very, very low occurrence event, but it does sometimes happen. Usually we recognize it immediately at the time of the procedure and are able to fix it. If we don't recognize it at the time of the procedure, it's usually very small and something that does not necessarily need re-intervention. In general, like I said, that's a very low risk, low frequency event during these operations, but it is a specific risk that's unique to this operation. So let me talk a little bit about just having cardiac surgery in general, because these are sort of the most frequent questions that I get. I get sort of, how long will I be in the hospital? What's it like? What's my recovery like? So let me start at the top. In general, you'll be in the hospital from about 4 to 7 days. It really depends on each person. In general, this population of the HOCM population of patients does very well because you guys are in general in good shape. You're doing well and have sort of one specific problem that if you fix, you can do really well. So about 1 day in the ICU, another 3 to 4 to 5 days in the hospital, and then you go home. Once you go home, you'll usually feel like you got run over by a truck for 2 weeks. Okay, and that's just being honest. And I don't even mean from pain. I just kind of mean you're going to feel wiped out and tired, and that's very common. That's not unique to this operation. That's just sort of the nature of general anesthesia, having a major surgery. You feel tired. Usually by a month, patients are back to their old selves and even much better. I find that this operation is probably the most satisfying operation that I do because patients feel much better and they usually feel much better right away. I will often have patients tell me in the hospital, they can tell a difference when they're walking the hallways on post-op day 1, when they're eating a meal. And you can do really well from this operation and really improve the quality of your life. So that's sort of septal myectomy. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you want, and we'll kind of move along to transplant here. So sometimes patients with inherited cardiomyopathies end up having heart failure and needing a transplant or some sort of mechanical device. As many people know, heart transplantation was born at Stanford. And this is a picture of Norman Shumway, and the background is a picture of the first heart transplant at Stanford. And it really was, the birthplace of heart transplant here. And I get my pay docked if I don't show the obligatory Norman Shumway slide. But honestly, he was a true pioneer and really brought this field into existence. So this is a little bit of an advertisement of our program. And I can give you sort of more specifics on the actual surgery itself and the recovery, but there's a lot of nitty gritty there. So Stanford Advanced Heart Failure has many physicians. There are many different centers within our advanced heart failure, including the HCM center, multiple subspecialties. We provide basically top to bottom care once you enter into the program. In terms of cardiac transplantation, we are top 5 nationally. We were number 4 last year. I think my next slide, next slide has the numbers. I'll go back. We performed nearly 2,000 heart transplants at Stanford. We do multi-organ transplants, including heart, liver, heart, kidney. Hopefully nobody here would need them, but in case you do, we're a good place to be. Sometimes patients are not eligible to transplant or need a bridge to get to transplant. We do all types of mechanical devices, and that includes ECMO, which is sort of a non-durable bypass circuit that can get people out of emergencies. I have done myectomies off of patients who are really sick on ECMO. It's sort of a life-saving device. We do all types of percutaneous VADs, We do destination VADs. Those are VADs pumps that you can live with for the rest of your life if you need to. And this just shows you, these are our heart transplant and LVAD volumes. Last year in 2021, we did 92 heart transplants just in the calendar year. That was 4th in the country. We do about 20 VADs a year, 20 to 30 VADs a year. We often don't have to go to VAD because we are able to transplant patients so quickly. Our transplant ratio, which is basically how fast we can get patients transplanted, was the best in the entire country. And our organ offer acceptance ratio is the best in California and the second best in the entire country. So we are basically limited only by getting patients in the door. But it's not just good enough to get patients through and get them transplanted. You want to have good outcomes too. And we have very, very good outcomes. So our 1-year graft survival is about 95%. And that is better, that's our observed mortality, right? Which is only about 5% in 1 year. And it's better than our expected mortality. That means we do really sick patients and we have better outcomes than we would be expected by how sick our patients are. I'm stuck here. There we go. Let's see if, there we go. So as I spoke about earlier, if you can't get a transplant, we do have other devices that we can use to get you through. And the most important one of that is the durable LVAD. This is showing Denton Cooley, who invented the first left ventricular heart pump in the 60s. And then this is just kind of a slide showing you the evolution of VADs over time. And a lot of times when people think of these pumps, they think of these big, giant pneumatic devices that used to sit outside the body, but that's really sort of an old-fashioned notion. So this is one of I'm not sure if you guys can see my cursor, but in the middle, that's a HeartMate XVE, and that's one of the sort of old-fashioned pumps, and it's sitting next to the HeartMate 2. And you can see that the HeartMate 2 looks like modern and sleek and great. Well, the HeartMate 2 in 2022 is obsolete. We're on to the HeartMate 3, newer, better, and smaller pumps. So this is a bit of an old slide here because it includes the HeartWare HVAD, which we don't use anymore. But most importantly, it has a HeartMate 3. It's about the size of a hockey puck. It sits on your ventricle and it pumps the blood from your ventricle to your aorta, and can allow you to function, basically do all the things that you really want to do. And that's another just showing you how it sits in the body and how big it is. You can see it's kind of easily fits in the palm of somebody's hand. This is just a slide about minimally invasive implantation of VADs. And basically I have this slide here just to show that almost everything we're doing is getting smaller and better, and the technology is getting better and improving. So there's, the outcomes are much better than they used to be. The outcomes are much better than I think most people think about. And recovery is better, and patients are doing much better with these procedures. So with that, I'll stop and I'll open it up for questions if that's okay.
Well, we already have some questions posted, so
Great.
I'm glad you're ready. Does it matter your age for septal surgery? I've had HCM since 21 and now I'm 61.
Sure. So no, it doesn't matter, honestly. I've done myectomies in patients that are 35 years old, and I've done them in patients that are nearly 80 years old. And really more than age, the most important thing is just kind of your overall general health. And that goes a lot into the things that Vicky was saying. The more you can eat healthy, exercise, and sort of do all the things to take care of yourself, the better you'll get through the surgery. 60 does not seem old to me for the surgery, so I don't think that's an issue at all. Wonderful question.
I have to share one of my favorite myectomy stories. I had this phone call from this woman who I swear sounded my age on the phone. And she said, I've had my surgery and I really wanted to go back to work full time, and I'm only able to go back part time. do you think if I give it another 6 months, I could go back full time? I'm like, well, what do you do? And she told me she ran cancer symposiums for a medical institution and that she'd been doing that job for 60 years. And I said, sweetie, how old are you? And she says, well, that doesn't matter. Age is a number. I'm like, no, I'm really interested now. How old are you? She was 93.
Wow.
And
That's
she was
incredible.
upset that she could only work 3 days a week. I'm like, girl, take some time off. So, you know, her surgery was at 93. So that was pretty awesome. Okay. I had a myectomy in late 2011 at Mayo. Went there because of their experience. Now my anterior leaflet is somehow hitting the septum that might have grown back. Is there a non-invasive way to fix this? A clip is not known to be a solution at this point. So can we discuss, before we answer what other options might be available, can you talk a little bit about the mitral anatomy and what it does over time with age, HCM or otherwise, and then talk about the options?
Sure. So over time, you can have changes to your mitral valve. I would say in the general population, your mitral valve is fairly static. If you are having increased turbulence or increased contact, it can get distorted and can get elongated, and that could possibly happen after myectomy. It's really tough to speak on your exact situation without knowing your anatomy and how the surgery went. There are several options of things they can do. One, they can just repair your mitral valve if that's all that, sometimes people, like I said, have true and unrelated problems that you may have a degenerative mitral issue that is now just kind of coming to a head at this point after myectomy. So repeat surgery, it is exceedingly unlikely or impossible that the myectomy, the myocardium grew back. So that doesn't really happen. Sometimes there can be an incomplete resection, although like the Mayo is a gold standard institution, so it's hard to, I'm just giving you sort of generic situations. If that is the case, you can always have a sort of a redo myectomy. We do a decent number of those I'd say almost never from the Mayo, but usually from community places where they do an incomplete resection. So that's a possibility. If it is your septal thickness, you might be a good candidate for the alcohol septal ablation, right? Since you've already had one shot at it, one open operation, that could possibly be a solution for this problem. And without knowing your anatomy, I'm not sure why you couldn't get a MitraClip. If it really is just an elongated anterior leaflet, a MitraClip might be the solution to this problem. So I'm just kind of giving you the broad strokes here.
Would you ever consider like a keyhole operation for just repairing the mitral valve? Are you guys doing those?
Maybe I'd have to see. I'd have to see the anatomy and the imaging. And
so there are a number of different options that could be available. Not necessarily top shelf stuff that you would, this is what we do. You'd have to evaluate the anatomy. You'd have to take a look at everything with the team and make decisions accordingly.
That's correct.
Okay, so.
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
Briefly? Just from, and thank you so much for that talk, Will, as usual, just totally inspiring and so informative. So thanks so much for making time. I think there are very, very, very rare cases, as Dr. Hiesinger said, growing back from myectomy is not a thing that we worry about. This is, in general, a definitive therapy for the obstruction. But there are cases in which the genetic diagnosis can actually help us if it's available with respect to whether your heart is actually thickening over time in extremely rare cases and extremely genetic causes. So I think exactly as Dr. Hiesinger said, having your imaging evaluated by, your cardiologist, hopefully with genetic testing, and then also by your surgeon is really important.
Agreed. Okay, so we have an interesting question here. So how do the incisions in the heart wall for the surgery heal when the heart resumes beating? Doesn't that disturb the incision, tightly stitched or something? I think there's a little misconception here. Can you
Sure.
clarify?
Yes, absolutely. So there's basically two incisions, okay? Other than the getting into your chest. So once we're in your chest, there's two incisions really. One is opening up your aorta, okay? So we do open up the aorta so we can go, that's the big blood vessel that leaves your heart. And we do that so we can go through the aortic valve and get to the septum, okay? The septum is just muscle. So we just cut out that muscle and we don't have to stitch together anything inside of the ventricle. Okay, so that septum, we cut it out and we leave it. And it doesn't really matter if there's bleeding, right? Because if it bleeds, it's bleeding into the chamber. Okay. Over time, the raw surface of the ventricle kind of scars over by our natural healing mechanisms, but we don't have to sew anything together. And that is all below the aortic valve, inside of the ventricle, just purely removing muscle. The operation itself is very conceptually simple. We open it up, we cut out muscle, and we close up. The thing that we are closing is the incision in the aorta, that big blood vessel leaving the heart, which is, inches away, inches being far in my world, away from where we're resecting the muscle. So the cut in the aorta and the cut in the ventricle are separated anatomically by worlds away. And we do not need to sew anything within the ventricle. That myectomy is cut out and it's gone. Did that make sense?
I think it makes sense. I'm hoping the questioner thinks it made sense, but they can actually write a follow-up if not.
Great.
Do you perform apical myectomies?
We
And
do.
How do you treat apical HCM?
Yeah, we can perform apical myectomies. It is just more rare that they come to us.
Now, there are a number of different techniques. We know Hartzell Shaft at the Mayo Clinic has kind of pioneered cutting from the apex up, but Nix Madeira and others will take the same approach and kind of push the heart up and go down into the apex. What's your approach?
Sure. My approach is much more like on the Cleveland side of that. We can, we should be able to get all the way down to the apex if we need to. You can do either way. And I have to say that I rarely see solely apical obstruction. If we do, my first approach is usually through the aortic valve, and we can do that. We can either also do it transapically, or a third approach is by going through the left atrium, taking down the anterior mitral leaflet and doing it that way as well.
Very good. I'm sorry. This
No
cold
problem.
is killing me. And it's getting worse as the night goes on. I apologize. How long in general does an LVAD last?
So that is a wonderful question, and I'm going to give you some hemming and hawing answers. But the bottom line is that it's built to last forever, right? I mean, we have patients who have been on LVADs for a decade, okay? In general, when the LVAD technology is evolving over time. The HeartMate 3 was only approved for destination therapy probably 4 years ago. So we don't have that sort of huge long-term data on it. So, and our first studies in LVADs were often in older, sicker patients than we're seeing. But the bottom line is that it can last forever. Those are very durable pumps that last a long time. We have many patients on there for years. So I hope that answers the question. It's something that you can put in and expect to have for many, many years if you need it.
Is there a way to visualize the electrical pathway during the myectomy?
So, wonderful question. If you can find a way, you'll make many millions and millions of dollars. You can't see the nerves and you basically have to use pathology to do that, which means slides and stains to see it. It's not visible to the naked eye, but you just have to know your anatomy really well. And if you do not have a right bundle branch block on your preoperative EKG or some sort of aberrant rhythm or aberrant block, it is very unlikely you will need a pacemaker. If you do have a right bundle branch block, that changes things a lot, and you will probably need a pacemaker, but likely that's a lower percentage of patients.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to hold the rest of the questions till the final session. And now we are going to hear, I believe, about genetics, correct? From Julia.
Yep. I think we got
Julia, first one to the meeting, last one to speak. So thank you for hanging in there with us all night. And Julia, we're going to hand over the podium to you. Here is your podium.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so I'll just start here. So yeah, it's actually really nice to be able to wind up the presentation part of things, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about our team approach to whole family HCM care. Of course, the whole family part being through the lens of genetics and family screening recommendations and genetic testing. As genetic counselors, our focus is on the whole family and the whole person a lot of the time, whether we're, taking a family history as part of the intake process, whether we are making recommendations to keep family members safe and try and identify at-risk people early when we can do the most, when our team can do the most support and work, and then also with genetic testing. But really, the truth is that the whole team is thinking about your family all the time and thinking about all the different parts of you all the time. It's been really nice to hear everyone's approach, and you can see how many facets of an individual's care we're thinking about, and how much kind of coordination it takes to put all of these pieces of care together to try and come up with a combined, synthesized approach to taking care of our patients with HCM. So I'm going to cover three main topics. The first one is really going to be, sort of a very genetics focused topic of family screening and genetic testing. And then I'm going to transition into some slides that were kindly provided to me by Nancy Robles, one of our nurse practitioners who's also on this call, about clinical decision making, which is an aspect of, kind of shared care between us and you that involves, many aspects of what we've talked about so far, in addition to genetics. And then we'll be talking, and then I'll talk about some of the changes and improvements that we've been making in terms of, how we are integrating whole family care at our center. So, in terms of when I think about seeing someone in clinic, I really do think about two sides of genetics. So one is family screening and identifying people who may either be affected or may be at risk simply by virtue of a relationship and the shared genetics in the family. And then the second aspect of what I think about is genetic testing. So starting with family screening, we usually will relatively early in a visit take a family history just to see. You can see here, this is what the family looks like in your life. And then this is the diagram that the genetic counselor is drawing in clinic to try and represent that for our records in our notes. Sometimes a family history is extremely clear, and the family already knows about multiple individuals who have been diagnosed with HCM. Sometimes there might be histories that were never quite put together, and we're able to uncover a previously unknown history of HCM. And sometimes the person coming into clinic is the first person who has had any symptoms and first person to get the diagnosis. And then when we start recommending that their family members get checked, we uncover a family history that way. So when we do have someone who's diagnosed, we do recommend ongoing heart checks for all first-degree relatives. And first-degree relatives are people who have a 50% chance, most likely, of having a genetic predisposition for HCM, and they are the parents, siblings, and children of a person who has the diagnosis. And generally, depending on age, there are alterations to the frequency that we would recommend getting checked, but we would recommend that they have a cardiologist visit, an echocardiogram, and an ECG at baseline, usually a little more frequently for children, a little less frequently if we have asymptomatic adults. But that's sort of the baseline recommendations just based on relationship. Now, with genetic testing, we can add an additional layer of accuracy to our recommendations. And sometimes it might change some of the ways that we're talking to a specific patient about their own care. But most of the time, genetic testing really does help guide family screening. So right now with cardiovascular panels. Usually current testing will cover about 100 genes. Not all of those are HCM specific genes. We have just learned over time that there is a lot of overlap between genes that cause HCM, genes that cause other types of hereditary cardiomyopathies, genes that cause hereditary arrhythmias, and also there are conditions that can affect multiple systems in the body, but may have HCM or another cardiomyopathy as one feature, and the treatment for that can be quite different. And so those are usually included on the panel to capture those situations as well. So then after a genetic test is ordered, usually there are 3 different outcomes that will come from the result. So we would either have a positive result where, oh, excuse me, I shouldn't have clicked on that. A positive result where we're able to find a DNA marker that has caused the HCM. Or it can be completely negative where current testing has not been able to identify a marker, or it can be unclear because there is a lot of just normal healthy genetic variation between people in general. It's a lot of what drives why we're different. And sometimes the laboratory in our current state of knowledge isn't always able to conclusively sort out what's just normal healthy genetic variation and what might be contributing to a condition like HCM. So with today's technology, about 50% of people who get genetic testing for HCM will have a positive genetic test result. And then once we have that, we'll go from the scenario that I was previously describing where, all of the closely related people in the family have ongoing heart screening to just being able to test each individual and taking them from a 50% risk to just kind of a yes or no answer. Either they did inherit the genetic risk and then we're kind of empowered by knowledge to follow people more closely, or they didn't inherit the genetic risk in the family. And then we usually do have a degree of humility about genetics just because we've seen how much it's changed over time and, we're discovering new things all the time. So we usually do recommend at least one lifetime baseline screen for folks who test negative. And of course, anybody in the family who has cardiac symptoms for any reason should always get a cardiology check, whether the cause may be related to HCM or not. And an important thing to also remember is that a negative genetic test result does not rule out that there's something genetic in the family or that other people in the family could have HCM. So, as I'm mentioning, genetics has improved a lot. It continues to improve, but we still have a lot to be able to offer in the future. So right now, 25% of people who test negative actually do have a family history. And so when people either have that negative or unclear result, we still do recommend those physical checks for all of their closely related family. So, we have these recommendations and, it's easy enough and kind of clear enough to make a recommendation like that. But the truth is that, all of these decisions and situations, they have an impact and they're more complicated to navigate in life than kind of just simply, when I put them up on a screen. And Nancy Robles was kind enough to share some of the slides that she recently presented at one of our support group meetings about clinical decision making. And the truth is that it really is, it is a team approach on our side, and sometimes it's actually a family sort of team approach on your side. And a lot of what we're doing in clinic is trying to trade information with the people that we're seeing to learn more about them and what their needs are and share our expertise to try and come up with a solution that best is tailored to their situation. So, some of the potentially life-impacting decisions in HCM, and by all means, this is not exhaustive, but, getting a defibrillator, decisions about surgery or ablation, whether to have genetic testing either for, a person's self or for children if there is a DNA variant that's been identified, disclosure of diagnosis to family, and not just a decision about whether to do it, but if you decide to do it, how are you going to do it? And, and take into consideration all of the weird and wonderful family dynamics that are present in most families, right? And in addition to that, the impact of exercise recommendations, restrictions on people who where athleticism is really important in their life for various reasons, whether professionally or personally, and then family planning. These are just some of the ways that, some of the big situations that, that people have to navigate. So, how this looks in our clinic appointment is, we really do try and take into consideration all of the key people that go into kind of thinking through each of these situations or decisions in a comprehensive way. So obviously the person who's affected, their family members. And then, I have a saying that I really, really like that's based out of some of the counseling literature that kind of says, you coming into clinic, you are the expert in your life. You're coming to us in clinic because we have expertise. And each of these people, that I've listed out here has a specific expertise, the physician, the surgeon, our advanced practice nurses, the genetic counselor. We have a cardiac psychologist on staff who could be really helpful with these, navigating these types of situations and decisions. And each of us has trained and really worked hard to gain experience to be able to contribute our expertise to your care. But the truth is that you're the expert on your own life. And so we have to partner with you to trade expertise so that we can come up with a plan through the shared decision-making that so many people today have been talking about. So, some of the key considerations when there is a decision to be made, obviously medical information about options, risks and benefits to be weighed. And that conversation happens in the context of a person's life. So, quality of life considerations, personal values, how that interrelates with family values, and then also emotional state and coping. People who face tough situations in their life very understandably have reactions to them. They're just expected. They are, while individual and important in an individual life, they're also expected when a person faces adversity. And so that's something that we like to be aware of. And so, in a genetic counseling visit, for example, we will often ask questions about, what are your values? How are you, how is this affecting your life? How are you coping with it? Just so that we can get a sense of all of that context and whether or not it plays into your decision making about genetic testing itself. Oftentimes it will give background that maybe we can kind of provide to the team so that they can use it as they're talking to you in their conversations. We'll also often, as I'm taking the family medical history, I'll usually ask about family relationships, because whether communication is open or maybe it's a little tricky with some person versus another, that really helps me to coach people on how they might consider talking to family members about risks to them. And so that's something that we gladly, are happy to partner with you and share ideas that have come out of other visits and other family situations. So another thing that we do is, you've heard a lot about the research that our providers do on your medical options, but the genetic counselors are also really invested in researching how best to provide genetic counseling care, how to, talk to you about your lives and how best to respond in a way that's helpful. So, if you do come to clinic and you get an email before or after the clinic visit asking you to complete a survey, please know that that's what it's about. And if you have a second to just fill it out, it really helps us to know not only how best to take care of you in our clinic, but to publish those results so that other genetic counselors can also benefit from it. In the past, we've also been very, very involved on, pioneering best practices in terms of interpretation of genetic test results, and also partnering with our other clinician partners to push that forward now. Many of our genetic counselors are involved with that. So there are a lot of ways that we kind of, travel throughout the different team aspects of your care. So speaking of that, one of the sort of elephants in the room is about family care is that we're spanning generations, right? And, we have both a adult hospital where many of the people that you're seeing speak tonight are housed, and then we also have a pediatric hospital, Stanford Children's, and they are very related but independent institutions. And so we've worked very, very hard to develop close relationships, clinical and research collaborations, to make sure that we can, provide as seamless care as possible, while recognizing that the institutions are somewhat separate. And I'm very excited to, kind of share with you that we are actively working on bridging the administrative sides of those two hospitals as well now. So, we have always had a very close collaborative approach when it comes to clinical collaboration, shared families, all of the physicians, they talk all the time, they collaborate closely, they come to weekly center meetings where, we keep up to date and share information if that's desired. And so that has always been in place. In terms of our weekly center meetings, even beyond just the collaboration between the adult side and the children's side, we also collaborate very closely, and Dr. Ashley is very involved and was one of the founding directors of our clinical genomics program that has the genetic panels that are based on a genome backbone, which is kind of a next generation platform from the exome backbone that most of cardio panels are based on. We also have, in addition to just kind of the clinician collaboration that happens at our meeting, we also have seminars where we invite other world leaders in the field to trade information and to trade ideas. And then, of course, there is the lab side of things where the future of genetics basically is being pushed forward all the time. So all of that is going on, and the administrative side is the part that we are focusing on now. We've formed this year a family care transition task force that has representatives from, both MD, nurse, and genetic counseling, and then also support staff representatives from both sides of the pediatric and adult hospitals. And our mission is to optimize the patient experience and the care of patients and their families through this flow back and forth, both through, transition of care as pediatric patients, age into a time when they are ready to transition care to their adult cardiologist, and then also for these family screening recommendations to ease that flow. So, we're just doing our best to keep pushing forward the science, the whole person, and the whole family approach. And in partnership with HCMA, I mean, it's been so lovely to hear about all of the cylinders that are going in so many different directions for advocacy on that front as well. And it's just such a privilege to be part of this community.
Well, we like having you here too. Okay, boys and girls, it's time to do all of the questions. We'll start with the most recent talk, and then we'll go back and pepper the other ones in. So everybody wake up.
It's just you I'm thinking about. It's early days for us over here. It's getting late for you.
It's 11 o'clock at night here, and I have a cold, and so I was in Sweden, which is 6 hours ahead of me, and now I've been back for 2 whole days. And now you're 3 hours behind me. So I have no idea what time it is. My brain is just I have no idea. But these are just small problems. Okay. So I'm going to start with a slightly complicated one. So keep the generational map in mind here. What is the best way to handle a situation when a grandniece of a deceased family member, age 21, due to undetected HCM, has a yearly checkup, and parents ask for an echo due to family history, and the physician declines the referral to cardiology because the family member, no family members have been diagnosed with HCM. A grandniece. So how many, I think, to me, the first question is, how close is a diagnosis of HCM to this grandniece? Is a parent, is a grandparent, where is HCM in the rest of this family tree, or is it this one relation who is 2 steps away? Julia, help me.
Well, I
Family
will say
tree.
I am drawing out a family tree here and making some guesses about what this looks like. My best guess, just off of the top of my head, because grandniece, there are a couple of different relationships that I could kind of put under that label, but I'm guessing that there are at least 3 generations, 3 steps removed. So, currently firm recommendations for family screening are for this 50% zone. So parents, siblings, and children, and anybody who's outside of that zone, I wouldn't say that we have firm recommendations that they should get screening unless they're having symptoms, which of course anybody should get screening if they're having symptoms. That said, when children are involved, I never discourage someone from getting their child's heart checked. That just seems, that's not within my ability to do. So I would certainly say that if parents have, concerns and they want that peace of mind that comes from, having had an echocardiogram, then I would support that, but I wouldn't necessarily be able to provide, medical recommendations that could back that up.
Yeah, it gets a little more complicated the further you get away from the person with a clear diagnosis of HCM.
Yeah.
And the family's been stunned with an early death.
It's hard. Yeah. And, I don't know if it would help, sometimes numbers help and sometimes they don't. But, if there are 3 degrees of separation, that would put the grandniece at a 12.5% chance of having inherited the genetic risk. And not everyone who inherits a genetic risk necessarily goes on to have findings of a disease. It's we call it reduced penetrance. So, sometimes hearing a number like that can help, but just as you were saying, Lisa, sometimes the situation, it's been, it's impacted a family hard enough that, numbers don't help. And I can definitely understand that.
Thank you. That was a tough one. There's not as many brain teasers ahead. So
Okay.
how often should somebody redo genetic testing? The last time this person had it done was 7 or 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm going to add on to that question. When do we go to exome gene sequencing as opposed to just the panels?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So I would say that if someone has had testing 7 or 8 years ago, it's time to consider an updated panel. Usually around that time, depending on what lab was used, they probably had a targeted HCM panel, and it may have been, I would say somewhere around 12 to 18 genes. And, we do have the 100 gene panels now, so I usually will offer an updated test. And I'm sorry, the second part of that question was?
Is just are the genetic panels available today through the traditional genetic testing companies, I'll just call it. Is that adequate, or should we go to exome sequencing?
Yeah.
When do you make that jump?
Yeah, so when we might think about exome sequencing are kind of 2 main scenarios. One, especially if there was something unusual about the presentation of the HCM, or there were multiple generations or multiple people that were involved, that would be something to consider. Right now, though, I think we have a lot of interest in, genome sequencing. There have been a few publications that are looking at the regulatory regions around the known HCM genes, and exome sequencing just looks at the coding parts that kind of give the ingredient list for, the way that the heart is structured, but they don't give the instructions that tell us how to combine the ingredients, if that makes sense. That's one of the reasons why our panel has been based on a genome backbone that captures at least the information for those regulatory regions. And so I think from my point of view, my next move would be to try and look at those regulatory regions. Likely it would be on a research basis at this point, rather than an exome, because that would kind of be looking for new undiscovered genes. And I know that there's been a lot of work through many institutions on gene discovery. And it hasn't necessarily been as fruitful as we wanted.
Okay, we have another genetic question that was posed very early in the night. So Chip, I hope you're still with us. Have you ever been able to identify a constellation or possible constellation of diseases with similar genetic basis? He has a hereditary blood disorder and HCM. Are there different diseases that could be triggered by
So
the
I
same
wanted to
genetic
thank
mutation?
you, Chip, for submitting your question early because it gave me a chance to look into it while everyone else was talking. That was wonderful. So I will say that there's not a clear genetic unifying factor between those two conditions. I was able to find a case study of a multi-generational, like 3-generational family where that association was reported in 1987. But that genetic testing has evolved so much since then. I'm guessing that there was a second condition in that family that was just kind of traveling along with the HCM. And I haven't seen any other more recent reports. That said, and so I would suggest, I'm sure you're under the care of a hematologist for that, but kind of talking to them about if there are possible referrals to think a little bit more about genetics on that. But they may be just kind of linked in your family if you have multiple people affected. So even though that particular condition doesn't necessarily have a genetic link, it does give me an opportunity to kind of bring up this idea that there are genes that can affect multiple body systems, and those are included on most modern panels.
I'm glad you were able to research that because I looked at that when it went up earlier. I'm like, that's a complicated one. Okay. So does the presence of significant pulmonary hypertension change your strategy for exercise recommendations?
That is such an important question. So I think when I have patients who already have significant pulmonary hypertension, my question is what happens to that pulmonary hypertension with exercise? And we can actually measure that with an echocardiogram. So if you do an exercise stress echo, we can understand how your pulmonary hypertension changes. And then the next question is, really, what are we doing medically to treat your pulmonary hypertension? Right? So that we can prevent it from limiting you from doing what you'd like to do exercise wise. I think that at the point that pulmonary hypertension is exercise induced, we do want to be really careful about our exercise prescriptions for patients. And so in that scenario, I would definitely encourage you to talk with your doctor. But I will say that it is a very, very rare case. In fact, I've never recommended that someone not exercise because of pulmonary hypertension. It's just a question of how to do it safely.
I think everybody can agree that exercise is always good. It's just finding the right balance for your anatomy, whether it be your obstruction or your pulmonary hypertension, etc.
Exactly.
Regarding exercise, anonymous attendee, if I'm limited to 60% of maximum heart rate, I might as well sell my bike. If my obstruction can be decreased by a myosin inhibitor, can I do more?
That is such a great question. So as we were talking about sort of the guidelines for understanding what that 50 to 70% range is for you, one option for folks is the 6% of max heart rate, but there are many reasons why that doesn't work for people. So number one, if you're on a medication that's going to blunt your maximum heart rate, then that's going to put you down at a really low heart rate, right? At 60%. And that may not feel good to you. And it also may not actually be reflective of 60% of your max exertion. So I think in that case where you don't feel as though you're at that 50 to 70%, range, if, you're able to, sing opera while you're exercising at 60% of your max heart rate, then I think we should be thinking about changing that that prescription for you away from a heart rate based prescription to what we call a Borg scale, which is a subjective exertion scale, where we want you to think about, okay, this is what I feel like at 100% of my max on a stress test that's monitored. I'm going to ratchet that back to about 50 to 70%. Don't sell your bikes.
Don't sell your bike. Bad idea to sell your bike. Okay. A non-obstructed HCM patient, by the way, that was a great answer. A non-obstructed HCM patient with an ICD recently began to detect PVCs with a simple heart monitor at home. Low PVCs at rest, higher with moderate activities. What's bringing this on? Are AFib and PVCs caused by the same electrical signals?
That is such an astute question, and I love it for multiple reasons. Number one is that yes, these are most likely cellular mechanisms, meaning that they are in both the atrium and in the ventricles. PVCs, the V in PVC is for ventricle, which means that that is what we call abnormal automaticity. Abnormal automaticity just means that cells are beating out of turn, just like the mutiny we talked about in the atrium. When you have a single cell or a small group of cells beating out of turn, that can turn into PVCs or PACs, as when we see them in the atrium. AFib is a sort of very progressed state of those PACs that, turns into the mutiny we were talking about. But yes, at its core, it's a very similar mechanism. And what that means functionally is that it can be treated often by the same type of medication. And so working with your doctor to think about, especially if those PVCs are uncomfortable during exercise, how they can be controlled is a really good plan.
Okay, so I think we've answered that one well. Okay, Chip's back. Long before my HCM diagnosis, I tried to get more physically fit, overcoming output capacity limitations with caffeine and excessive exercise intensity. Independently, the same was the response by two other relatives with HCM, i.e. drawing two counterproductive behaviors unwittingly because of HCM. Don't know if that's a question or a statement. I see it more as a statement. We acknowledge you, Chip.
I
Yes.
think it's an important experience, and I'm so glad that you've come around to understand that caffeine and excessive exercise might not be the way to get yourself feeling as well as you do.
Anybody here have the cure to the common cold? I could really use it right about now. Sorry. It's getting worse as the night's going on, people. I'm so sorry. My family has a myosin heavy chain, MYH7 gene mutation. We all have heart failure. Is heart failure the main feature of this gene as well as others?
Julia, do you want to take that, or we can tag team?
Yeah, I think maybe tag teaming, yeah, maybe I'll let you go first. I mean, certainly myosin heavy chain, I'm trying to think about it in terms of HCM, but then also it can be associated with DCM, which also can lead to heart failure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I'll let you answer that one, Vicki.
Yeah, and I think, we have multiple folks here on the call who probably have things to add to this question. There is data about MYH7, myosin heavy chain, in the SHARE registry, which has been published to show that those patients, along with patients who have other variants in genes that are in the rowboat and the sarcomere, actually can have worse outcomes. So it depends on what particular type of heart failure your family has. As Julia mentioned, MYH7 can manifest itself as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but there are families that have more of a dilated cardiomyopathy phenotype. But what we do know is that your family is not alone in experiencing more severe symptoms and outcomes related to an MYH7 variant, as opposed to patients with HCM who do not have a sarcomeric diagnosis. And it may mean, depending on the type of heart failure that you have, again, it's really important to understand whether it's heart failure symptoms due to obstruction versus actually a weakening of your heart. That may be an opportunity for a myosin inhibitor, but that's really important to talk with your doctor about what's causing that heart failure.
Yeah, I might just add as well to that answer that from the earliest days, I think we all realized that understanding the genetic basis of a condition can give us some guidance and helps us identify who in the family we should pay most attention to in screening. But it's definitely not a determinant of outcome. There's nothing inevitable about having a myosin heavy chain variant that means you're going to get heart failure or you're going to have a bad outcome. As Vicki mentioned, if we compare patients who are found to have a genetic variant with those who are not, or those who are found to have a clearly pathogenic variant compared to those who only have a variant of uncertain significance, they do appear overall to do a little less well from many points of view, but there's nothing inevitable about it. There's a lot of variation in families, and I think keeping close contact with your medical team is the best way to a healthy future.
So I'm going to stop for 1 second and say thank you to the people watching on Facebook. We're going to say goodbye to them right now. So goodbye, Facebook people. And for those of you who are in the webinar, if you want to post a question that will not be asked and placed on the internet for all eternity, this will be your opportunity once we stop Facebooking. So later, Facebook.